Okay, today is the 21st day of Kislev. It's also the 4th of December. And we're up to the very end of the section on page 30, before the base. And here we mentioned that the higher something is, like they say in timber country, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Right? So the higher something was, the more it can descend when it comes down. And we mentioned the mashal, the parable that's usually given of a wall that falls down, so the stones that were the highest up will fall the furthest away. Now he's going to give us another mashal for this. He's going to give another parable. We said that there needs to be a parable from, according to this is Tzemach Tzedek, he's before the Rebbe Rashab, but the Rebbe Rashab had this idea that for any issue that you want to discuss, you should have two parables, one from science and one from psychology. Meaning one from the Rebbe Rashab. And he's usually very good about it. He gives usually two things for everything they discuss. So here he's going to give us another one. It's also rather scientific. He says like this, Kinautz tchilatan besofan daika, because the beginning is wedged in the end. That's from Sefer Yetzirah. And again, what it means is that something that was in the start reaches the lowest, reaches the end. V'leshon Kabbalah, what is this called in Kabbalah? So this will be like in a certain sense, our psychological, we'll have to take it as our psychological parable. הוא עניין הערת הכתר שמגיע אורו למטה מבחינת החוכמה. So there's a concept that the light of the crown reaches lower than wisdom. Wisdom is right underneath crown. Chokhmah is right underneath Keter. And yet, Keter is able to shine all the way. What is he talking about? He's talking about Ak, what we call Adam Kadmon, the Partzuf, the persona of primordial man in Kabbalah. It is an encompassing light, encompassing all the worlds, all the way from Atzilut all the way down to Asiya. What does that mean? So the translation, we'll try to say this in really psychological language, is that the person who has the crown on his head has to be. How is he judged? How do we know if he's the right leader, if he's worthy of being a leader? We have to see whether his understanding, whether his influence reaches all the way down to the lowest people. Meaning, if he's beloved by the people, then he's the right person. Now, this is very problematic, right? Because we look. What were you saying, Pirkei Avos? What does it say? It's not talking about a king there. No, it says who's beloved above is okay. Okay.
I get a little confused. Who are we talking about?
This is an example.
Okay.
This is an example. How is it that the thing that's highest has to reach the lowest? Yeah. So, if you look at the Rebbe, for instance, so you see that scholars of Torah, Talmidei Chachamim, they appreciated it to some extent. I don't think enough, but it takes time to understand. Really, when it comes to learning, it takes time for people to process what's going on. Especially because even the students don't really get it for a long time. They don't understand the depth and the intricacy of what's going on unless you share with them everything. And the Rebbe wasn't into that.
There's only a few really understood.
Yeah, very few people it takes time to understand the greatness of a person in scholarship. But in terms of leadership, so you see who comes to him. You see all the simple people in the world. Why do they come to him? Because they feel that he has a part of them. That's what it means that primordial man, Ak, Adam Kadmon, who's in the crown, he is an encompassing light all the way down to the world of action. So we have these leaders that you see that they're real leaders because the simple people connect to them. So that would be a parable in psychology that we could take out of this. Now he's going to give us a scientific parable for this. כמו שמבואר במקום אחר, ממשל הגעת חמימות השמש באוויר השלישי הסמוך לארץ ביותר, הרבה מאוד מבאוויר האמצעי העליון ממנו ועוד שם באורך. So, first of all, to understand the science, these sages were not scientists. Even today, take someone regular, Talmidei Chachamim. They're not scientists. They have no idea. They may read here or there. Maybe they went to YU, so they know a little bit more. But in principle, they're not scientists. It's not their job. So every once in a while, there's a book written that sort of summarizes all the science to that point. Now it's very hard to do because there's so much. But in the 1800s, it was still common. In the 1700s, it was still common. Every 100 years, you'd find a book. So the book that everyone in Chabad used was called Sefer HaBrit, the Book of the Covenant. It was written by a guy whose name was Eliyahu, now I forget his last name, from Vilna. They call it Eliyahu from Vilna. He wasn't really from Vilna. He was born there, but then his father became a Chasid. This is almost the time of the Baal Shem Tov, it's the time of the Magid. They moved to a more Hasidic area. And then he wrote this book later. It was published a little bit before the Tanya. And it's a book that covers all the science in their time, what they knew. And so anytime you have a concept in Chassidus before the Rashab, for instance, even after the Rashab, this was the reference that everyone used. Yeah, it didn't. People who are steeped deeply in Torah, they didn't read other things at all. So if they read something, they read this book. And it's a very interesting book because it doesn't just explain the science of the times. It actually draws the correspondences between the science of what we call the scientific revolution. We're actually here deep inside the Enlightenment. We're getting upon Napoleon already. And he explains that science relative to the ancient science that the sages knew in the Talmud, which is very important because it's very hard to link today's science, the modern science that we have, with what the Talmud knew. Very hard job because so much has changed. And so if you want to understand where they correspond, how they parallel, like the greatest question is always, what do you do with electricity? Electricity was almost an unknown phenomenon in the time of the Talmud. It wasn't completely unknown. It was known to some extent in the way that the ancient world, they knew about electricity. They knew static electricity. They knew lightning is a form of static electricity and so on. And so they knew a little bit about it, but they really had no... But by 1840, you have Maxwell's 4 laws of electromagnetism, and that completely opens everything. So to connect... So we come along in the late 1800s, and we have to decide whether electricity is permitted on Shabbos or not. So that's a tall task, because there's almost nothing to compare it to in the Talmud. So this book of the Covenant is a very important book because it's a link between the two. Another important link is the Malbim. Malbim was a little bit later. He's actually a more updated version, but he wasn't as systematic. He was more into explaining Scripture. Mm-hmm. But in his explanation of Scripture, he brings a great deal of science of the late 1800s. He already talks about evolution. He talks about statistics. He talks about theories of light. He has electromagnetism. He's got it covered. He really talks about everything. The problem is nobody's ever put together a collected volume of all the Malbim's writings on science, but there's a great deal. So, in their time, they divided the atmosphere into 3 parts, and I don't remember what they called them. It's not that. When the Tzemach Tzedek was writing this, the Sefer HaBrit, the Book of the Covenant, 1780s, they divided the atmosphere into 3 parts, and they saw something very interesting, that the higher you go, the lower the temperature. Right? It's very interesting. It's counterintuitive, because you're getting closer to the sun. Why would the temperature go down? Obviously, the reason we know today is because the less atmosphere there is, the less heat can be captured. And so you're getting into space. Space is dead cold. It's almost absolute zero. It's not absolute zero, but it's close to. And that's because there's nothing there to capture the heat. To capture heat means there have to be molecules that move around. Right? What's the equation? That's not the equation. I thought you would know as a pharmacist. You would remember how heat is a measure of motion of particles. There's an equation that does that. Anyway, so there's no molecules around, so there's no heat. So he says here, what? You learned that. For sure you learned it, you forgot it. In any case, so he says here, you see that the sun itself is very hot, and then where does the heat appear and manifest? Here below. The lower you go, the more you feel the heat of the sun. Meaning, in the higher reaches of the atmosphere, there's less heat. It's not that cold. It's minus 50, minus 60. When you go in an airline, they show you, what's the outside air temperature, and you see it's minus 70. It's really cold at 10 kilometers. And then, as you come nearer to the Earth, the heat obviously goes up, and that's one of the reasons why when you go up the Everest, it's very cold, because there's less molecules. Okay, so that's an example from science that the higher something is, the lower it descends. Okay, we could argue about this example, about how descriptive it is of this principle, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, so now we finally come to an explanation. There's one more piece we need. Until now, we've explained the garment. Remember, I told you that when we talk about tzitzit, it has two parts. It's the garment and the fringes. So the garment, now we know what the garment is. The garment is the encompassing light. It reflects the infinite aspect of God. That's what it does. Now we have to talk something about the fringes. We have to say something about the fringes. What's going on with the fringes? What are they? What do they represent? So the easiest thing is just to say, okay, they represent internalized light. But it's not that simple. We have to see what it is. So this is what chapter 2 is about. This is what chapter 2 now begins with. ואחר שנתבאר שלוש הקדמות אלו, טרם הבינך עניין הציצית, תזכיר לך ביאור עניין אחד בתורה, שהתבאר היטב על פי הקדמות שנאמרו למעלה. So he says, after these three introductions, which were all really geared at explaining what encompassing light is, now I want to give you one more introduction. And it begins with the question of Kriyat Shem Yisrael. This was in the previous parsha that we just read 2 days ago on Shabbos. That the angel gives Jacob his name Israel. And later God gives him the same name, Israel. And in our parsha, that's how it starts. It says, Ele toldot Yaakov. No, it's not toldot Yaakov. Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz meguray aviv be'eretz Canaan. Ele toldot Yisrael Yosef. Okay. Then it calls him Yaakov, and then immediately calls him Yisrael. So what is this name Yisrael? What does it mean? Sheperesh bazohar li rosh. It means I have a head. You take the letters of Yisrael and you permute them a little, and you get li rosh, I have a head. What does that mean? This is linked in the Zohar to God calling us Israel. And it's wondrous, he says. Why would he call us this? And the explanation is like this. When you say something has a head, I have a head, what you mean to say is I have a skull and I have the brain inside. The purpose of the skull is to encompass the brain. It's a box, basically. What does this mean spiritually? עניינו ברוחניות היא בחינת הרצון עליון ברוך הוא, שחופה על הטעם הכמוס שבו. He says like this. We know that there's will. We know that there's will in the person. In fact, when we talk about will, what are we talking about? So we said there's a big principle we've seen many times in the Zohar, that it's brought in Chasidut. It ratzon ve'it ratzon. There is a will and there is a will. There's the lower will. The lower will is a product of a person understanding, seeing his neighbor has a car, he says, I want the same car. Where did he get the idea? He got it from his mind. His mind saw something, he understood, he thinks it's something good, he thinks he has the money, whatever. It's a logical, supposedly rational process. And it has a definite, you can trace it back to its reason. It's clear what the reason is. Because you ask, why do you want a cookie? Because I ate a cookie yesterday and I know it's good. I want it. So there's a logical reason for it. You know exactly, you can trace it back. Maybe it's not logical, but there's a series of events that led up to it. But then there is higher will. And when we talk about will in Chasidus, when we talk about the faculty of will, we're not talking about the will that comes out of the mind. We're not talking about will that can be traced back to an intellectual process or to a sensory process. We're not talking about that at all. We're talking about higher will. Higher will is from the crown. And because it's from the crown, we say it has no reason. There's no reason behind it. The person just wants it. Right? For instance, we say about God, what do you want? So I want you to say Shema twice a day. Why do you want me to say it? Silence. No reason. I don't know. I want you to put on tzitzit. Why do you want me to put it on? No reason. I want you to put on tefillin. I want you to... Now those, maybe you can find some kind of logical reason to. But now I want you to slaughter the animal this way and not that way. Well, what difference does it make? I want you to keep Shabbos on the 7th day. I don't want you to keep it on the 3rd day. Why? What's the big difference? These things, they don't have a reason. So reason in Hebrew is the same word as taste. It means tam. We've already spoken a little bit about it. But higher will is not supposed to have a reason behind it. Now it's very interesting that in English, reason means two things. It means a cause, and it also means a logical process. So it actually fits well, even in English, that you say that higher will does not have a reason behind it. What you mean is it doesn't have an intellectual process behind it. Okay? So the higher will is the skull. That's what the skull represents. It represents the higher will, which is not supposed to have any reason behind it, except that but the skull, like we just said, which represents the reason, which represents the will, is encircling a brain inside. Okay? There's a brain inside. What does the brain do? The brain has processes of logic, processes of reason. So he says, even the higher will has hidden within it a concealed reason. Meaning there is a concealed reason why God wants me to slaughter an animal this way and not that way. And that's a very, very big observation. It runs contrary to a lot of things that people might think, but it's also stated in the sages. What do the sages say? They say that in the future, the reason for the mitzvos will be revealed. So if it will be revealed, it means that it must be somewhere. Why don't I see it? I don't see it because all I can see is the skull. Again, this is a very anthropomorphic picture of godliness, but we're trying to de-anthropomorphize it and trying to make it into something more abstract. And so from the structure of the brain, of the head, I take this concept that even though there's reason, there's also a concealed, even though there's will, there's a concealed reason inside. There is something guiding the reason why God said, do it this way, not that way. Okay? So what does it mean now? He says one of the proofs of this is that Moses, in one of his contemplations, in his aliyas neshama, his soul departs his body and he sees things. He goes into Rabbi Akiva's base medrash, he goes into Rabbi Akiva's academy, and he hears these wonderful teachings, but he's disheartened because he doesn't recognize any of them. And he says, what, 1,000 years after I'm gone, they started writing new Torah, what's going on? And so then, one of the students there asks Rabbi Akiva what's going on, and he says, this is halacha leMoshe Sinai. This is something that Moses learned at Sinai. He says, if it's like that, it just means that I didn't yet understand all the repercussions of what I'm teaching, and it's true. And then he sees that this man, Rabbi Akiva, he's able to teach piles of laws from one letter, or from one crown on a letter of the Torah. And he's very, very impressed by him, how much he's able to deduce from what he brought down from Sinai. And he looks at him and he says, so God, show me what his fate is. I want to see, is he the king of the world? Who is this man who understands Torah at this level? And he shows him how he's murdered by the Romans. And so Moses says, this is the reward that you get for learning Torah at this level. So God says to him, he says to him, quiet, be silent. This is what crossed my mind. This is what I have in my mind. And so, apart from the difficulties that this story presents morally, spiritually, whatever you want, we learn from this story, from this documentation, early documentation of Moses, that there is such a thing as a reason behind the will. Meaning, God did it this way, and we usually say, and it's specifically about the most difficult things in life, we usually say we don't know how God thinks. We don't know, we don't understand. We have to say that because otherwise we can't live in the world. And yet there is a reason behind it. What he's saying here is there is a reason. Kach ala b'mosha. So it elevated in my thought. This is how my thought goes. Now it's just we'll say that we can't say the punchline. So tomorrow we'll continue with what happens if the reason is concealed. So what about us? Are we never going to reveal any of that reason? So that's what we'll see tomorrow.